Hello, everyone. My name is Tina Ewing Wilson, and I'm an outreach specialist for Disability Voices United. And this is Buddy. I am pleased to welcome you to our next panel called "We Know We Don't Know Everything." This panel will discuss how data and other empirical evidence can be combined with personal stories like the ones you just heard in the previous panel to develop lasting solutions to racial, ethnic, and geographical disparities in education, healthcare, community services, and other systems. While much data exists about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, some of it isn't accessible to the public, and there is still much more data that should be collected. And one of the things I'm supposed to do is clear up stuff that's confusing. So can somebody tell me what empirical means? Because I read this and don't know what it means.
Empirical just means based on data.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. We have an esteemed panel here to discuss these issues. Our first speaker is Vivian Haun, a senior policy attorney for the IDD practice group at Disability Rights, California.
Tina, thank you so much. And so glad that you and Buddy could be with us today for this panel. Thank you so much to everyone who came today. In addition to being an attorney, I am also a sibling. I have a brother who has autism. He's 38 years old now and has been served by the regional center system for most of his life. A couple of other things about me. I started working at DRC in 2020 in this role, but prior to that, my background was actually in education. For many years, I worked as a special education attorney representing school districts. I also worked for a while doing special education policy and programming on behalf of charter schools in California before I started doing this work. And lastly, it wasn't until I was an adult that I was diagnosed with ADHD and generalized anxiety disorder. And when it was first suggested to me, I was like, no way. I'm a social education attorney. That was part of my job. My job was to spot, who here may have ADHD? I couldn't recognize it in myself. I just could not. So I was saying to Julie from the last panel, I feel you, and those issues are so real. I wanted to start a little bit by talking just a little bit more about why it's important to talk about data. Why is it relevant? Because data can feel kind of dry. It doesn't come across as a very sexy topic. But it's so important. It's so central to everything that we do, especially now, because at the end of the day, data is about establishing what is real. What are the facts? And in this age, when this is a worldwide problem, knowing what's real, knowing what information to trust, this is everything. Data helps us establish official facts. It helps us establish the real story that captures the truth of what you experience in your life every day. So when you say things like, for the record, and then you fill in the blank, that's the record. That's data. It's the official story that people use. People empower, policymakers rely on to make decisions about funding, about policies, priorities, and programs that affect your lives every day. And there are different kinds of data too. We all think of data, I'm sure, as numbers, hard facts, and that's a very important part of data. But data also includes stories, your stories. I like to think about these two different types of data this way. If you think of truth as a body of truth, the numbers and the hard facts are kind of like the bones. They give us the dimension and the shape of the body. I think of stories, your stories, as the flesh. It's the thing that gives those bones life, right? It's where the stories are expressed. So they're both very, very important to give shape and structure and life to truth, your truth. Have you ever experienced a problem or a gap or a failure in a system somewhere and you think, is it just me? Is it just me? And you're thinking, am I losing my mind? Is this just me? Data is what enables us to say, well, yes or no, right? And that's another reason why data is so relevant and so important. Because when we have good quantitative data, and that's the number, the hard facts, the numbers that I was talking about, it allows us to know whether what you are experiencing is an outlier, is it just a one-off, or is it part of a pattern, a bigger pattern? And if there is a pattern, how big is that pattern? Where is it taking place? How often is it happening? If it's happening to other people, who are those people? How do we find them? So data is something that enables us to connect all those dots, And that brings me to a few specific data points that I wanted to talk about today. I'm here to talk about both some education data points as well as some regional center data points that might be useful for us to think about. When we think about education data, there is a lot of education data available nationally and in California. For those of you who might be interested, if you haven't heard about it, there is a website or a section of the California Department of Education's website called DataQuest. DataQuest, if you can Google it, look it up. If you go to DataQuest, that is where you can go and look up all kinds of data and information, including special education specific data. And you can look things up often by school district or local education agency. But for right now, I wanted to talk about one particular data point that's actually a national piece of data. So under the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, states are required to put together what's called state performance plans. And in connection with that, they're supposed to put out what's called an annual performance report or APR, right? It's a report. Every year they're supposed to report on a number of data points. How are we doing in this state? So California has published and posted that data as well. I'm going to talk about one of those indicators, indicator 14. Because my background is largely with older students with disabilities who are of transition age and are looking to start the next phase of their life after school, this indicator is of particular interest to me. So indicator 14 tells us a lot about outcomes. So after all the work that you have put into school, all the IEP meetings, everything that you go through, when K through 12 comes to an end, what happens next? What are the outcomes? What happens to you as a student with a disability after you leave school? How well did the school do to prepare you for the life that you were to encounter outside of school? So indicator 14 asks LEAs, local education agencies, school districts, to report on the number of students who had an IEP who, 1 year after leaving high school, what is the percentage of students who are either enrolled in or engaged in some kind of post-secondary education, competitive employment, or some other kind of post-secondary program or work? So should be pretty simple, right? So last night I looked up the most recent numbers, and this data I believe is from 2022, just because of some of the delay in compiling and reporting the data. But I looked up the percentage of students with disabilities who were reported to have completed or to have met one of those three criteria. So for Los Angeles Unified School District, you want to know what it was? I'm rounding, but it's 84% is what was reported. In Oakland Unified, it's about 85%. And in Sacramento City Unified, a district that I think is very well known for having many years of struggle and difficulty with special education compliance, their reported percentage is 90%. How accurate do we feel? Like, does this feel accurate? Does this resonate? A few years ago, when I was privileged enough to be part of some state level conversations, what I found out was that although this isn't really talked about, if you think about how that data is collected, right? A year out of school, what are students doing? How do we find that out? Schools have to reach out and survey those students. They have to contact them and then get them to respond to a survey a year later. That's actually kind of hard. That's so much harder than a lot of other types of data that you can collect while someone is in school. So it's maybe not a surprise that the response rates aren't great, but what are they? Do we know? It's not stated anywhere. Is there any requirement that the response rate must be a certain level? In Washington State requires that their schools have a 70% response rate, and they provide technical assistance to those schools. Because you're a teacher, a counselor, administrator, you don't know that stuff. That's not what you were trained or hired to do. So, but it's so important. It's so important to the state of Washington to know the truth, to get the story right, to have a full and accurate picture. They provide technical assistance and support from universities to these schools to say, here's what you can do with survey design. Here's what you can do in terms of collecting this information, strategies you can use to make sure we have an accurate picture of what's happening to students. In the state of Wisconsin, they do that, what Washington does. They also just pay straight up financial incentives. They give incentive payments to school districts that meet that mark every year. You can look it up. Here, we don't even know what our response rate is. There's no requirement for a response rate, but anecdotally, in talking with a number of transition administrators, my best guess is it sounded like something probably around 20 to 30% at best. And this is among a group of very motivated, highly motivated, high achieving transition administrators. So I don't know what it might be for other school districts, maybe 40% here and there. That's not very good data. Why? Why? Do we care? Is it important and valuable for California to know what happens to students after they leave school? There's plenty of other data I could go into with school. I'll mention one and I won't talk about it quite as much in the interest of time. Many of you who have children who have gone to school in California may be familiar with the California School Dashboard that gives all kinds of data about the school. Oh, my time is up? Okay. Look there. There's something called the California and College Career Indicator. So look there. There are paths to being quote unquote deemed college and career ready, specifically for students with disabilities, students with IEPs who graduate or who leave school with a certificate of completion. Look there. If you're not familiar with that, look it up. Do we know more about it? We don't really. But lastly, I'm sorry, Judy, I'm gonna wrap up. There's, I think, some really important data that we still don't have in the regional center system. And I think that's important because, as Sergio and others have talked about today, and for really 10 years, over a decade, we know that there are some significant disparities in a particular type of data. And that data is spending data, right? Purchase of service expenditures. That's what has really driven the dialogue in our system for many years. But why is that? Why is that metric the measure, the primary measure that we've been using to define what we talk about when we talk about equity? It's really because it's honestly the only good and consistent data we have in our system, not because it is necessarily the most important piece of data we have in our system. Because while it gives us useful information, the amount of money that's spent on services for someone it's useful, but it does not tell us what we need to know at the end of the day. I know, Judy, it does not tell us what we need to know at the end of the day. Because the amount of money that's spent on someone's services, from that, it does not tell us the degree to which a person might be getting the supports and services that they need to live the kinds of lives that they want for themselves when they need it. And for my money, that's pretty important, and arguably more important than just how much is spent on them. And I think what we will start to do in the future, in like our equity and data conversations 2.0, is to start to look to more of that data. We don't have it all yet. Some of those data points are being developed and they're in the works, but we have so much more to do. It's those outcomes that I think will tell us so much more. And when we start to look at that data and we have those outcome data, I think they're going to be much more meaningful than just spending data. And then we start to disaggregate it by race and ethnicity and language and all the other things.
Thank you, Vivian.
That gap is
our
what we
next
have.
panelist is Amy Westling. Amy is the
Time blindness, sorry.
Go ahead, Tina.
our next panelist is Amy Westling. Amy is the executive director of the Association of Regional Center Agencies, also known as ARCA.
Good morning. Really pleased to be here today. Thank you, Judy, for the invitation. ARCA is a proud sponsor of this event. And like Vivian, I want to start with just a little bit of background about myself, for those of you that don't know me. As Tina said, my name is Amy Westling, and I am the executive director of the Association of Regional Center Agencies. We work with all 21 of the state's regional centers, but I didn't start in this position. Probably the position that I have loved most was where I did start, and that was as an intern for a regional center that was helping people in the Central Valley to navigate the country's immigration system. Because in 1998, we found ourselves in a position where individuals who were not US citizens were at risk of losing their SSI. And so as a regional center, we were working to help people through the naturalization process and paying the fees for that, because that isn't going to show up in any data. It isn't going to show up in the metrics about our system, but we knew this was critically important to the people that we served. And so that was probably my favorite job. The reason I left it, it was an internship and it was unpaid. And so, you have to make choices. But, that is really where my heart and my passion is. I appreciate Vivian laying the foundation for this discussion, because really data is important and impactful And it's not just important because it's little pieces of sound bites. It's important because it helps drive policy and it helps us to know where we're succeeding and honestly where we are failing, not just in the regional center system, but across various systems. One of the things that we do know is that when you have a child with a developmental disability, there are so many systems that come into your life. And there is the need for those systems to work well together and to work well independently as well. When we were listening to the family panel, I was most struck by the different places where different systems all failed the same person at the same time. And that's the challenge. How do we find ways to measure the effectiveness of various systems and then to use that data to improve those systems? So one of the things that Vivian talked about was that we use purchase of service data, so what the regional centers pay for, as a way to measure, are we providing things equitably? What that really tells us is, are we providing the same amount of dollars to everybody, which isn't the best measure, but it is the measure that we have. And so one of the reasons that we at ARCA drill into the data a little deeper is to figure out, what does the data tell us about our strengths and our weaknesses? So one of the things that we know is that if you look at the data about people who live at home with families, that there aren't a lot of disparities in those early years, in the birth through 2-year-olds. And then when you look at children who are school aged who live at home with families, there starts to open a gap. And then when you look at adults who live at home with families, the data that we saw earlier in the presentation, the gap gets wider. So this forces us to say to ourselves, what's working well in early childhood? What is it about our Early Start program that is working well and is enabling us to serve people equitably or at least equally? And then how can we take those pieces of what's working well and apply it to other age groups or other programs? One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was that we saw the allowance to begin including people who are in your network as caregivers through respite or personal assistance for your child. And do you know what we saw in the data as a result of that? We saw a closing of the gap in spending, because what we learned and what we should have known all along is that people feel most comfortable having people within their own social networks, family, friends, members of your religious community, to provide the care and relief that the family needs. So this is why drilling into the data is super important. One of the things that was done in the last couple of years was Georgetown University looked at data about our system, about the developmental services system, to tell us how we're doing in terms of some grant programs that have been in place for a number of years. And when we look at the recommendations that they came out with, they said one thing very clearly. They said, we need to clearly define equity. We need to know what we're talking about when we say equity, because then we can drive intervention. We can drive program choices. We can drive services to meet those needs. And then we can measure effectiveness. As Vivian said, we struggle in our system to measure outcomes, and we're working on it and we're getting better, but we're not there yet. We, at this point, can really measure spending, and we can measure, in some ways, the satisfaction of people with their services. But those things don't equate to outcomes. Outcomes are, what is the impact of the service in your family? Did the service meet its intended function? Did it help you meet your goals? And those are the kinds of things that we are driving towards to be able to help us to shape our services and make them better. While imperfect, healthcare systems have really clearly defined outcomes. Education systems have really clearly defined outcomes. In healthcare, you can tell whether a health plan is effective based on all kinds of widely agreed upon metrics. One of them being if somebody was in the hospital and was discharged, what percent of people avoided that next hospitalization within 60 or 90 days? Those are widely agreed upon outcomes. So one of the things that we need to do is to carefully figure out what things are we trying to measure, because that will then drive our system and our systems going forward. Other things that we need to look at are how do we incorporate information and data from other systems into our system? How to create a more robust picture of each individual, because people don't fit neatly in boxes. They don't receive services just from the regional center or just from a health plan or just from a school district. And the more comprehensive picture we have of a person and their needs and their goals and their supports, that will help us to, on a bigger scale, plan for how to do program improvements. And the last quick thing I wanted to say was one of the areas that ARCA is particularly interested in is better understanding the housing needs of people that are served by regional centers. Because there's a thought out in the universe that people served by regional centers have all their housing needs met. And they don't. It's just that we have a lot of people who are housed, but is that meeting the needs? And we need to be able to collect that data and look at it across race, ethnicity, language, and from a variety of other factors to, again, help us know where to invest as a state. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We will now move on to Victor Duron, the Director of the Master Plan on Developmental Services and the Chief Deputy Director of the California Department of Rehabilitation.
Thank you so much. Oh, that's loud. Thank you, everyone. So I used to refer to the being director of the Master Plan for Developmental Services as my night job, and being chief deputy director of DOR is my day job. And I think those two have switched. So it really is a great honor to serve in this role, but I have to admit, when Secretary Ghali first asked me to take on this role, I was a little confused. I said to him, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I'll share a little bit about my background. For the past 10 years or so, I've been working in government, spent some time during the pandemic years working in the homelessness space at the Interagency Council on Homelessness. Before that, with the independent living movement, which is a cross-disability civil rights movement. And before my career in state service, I worked with migrant farm workers and indigenous communities across the Bay Area. I've never worked at a regional center. I've never worked for DDS. And so I said to Dr. Ghali, are you sure? I'm not an expert in this space at all. And his answer might as well be the title of this panel. He said, yes, because we know that we don't know everything, okay? And I'm not asking you to take on this role for what you know, because we are doing this because there is an acknowledgement at the top levels of state leadership that we can do better in California in this system. And there is an acknowledgement at the top levels of state leadership that the government leadership are not the ones who are best situated to decide how to do better. He told me, so that's not your job. You don't need to be the expert. It's okay that you are new to this big, complex, beautiful world of the DD systems and the DD community. Your role is to create a place and a space for a diversity of voices from different communities to come together and lead this effort. So let me tell you a little bit about what the Master Plan for Developmental Services endeavors to do. Our goal is to create a framework developed with and by the diverse voices from communities across the state, with a suite of recommendations that will go to the administration for how we can make this big, complex, beautiful, challenging, frustrating system better. And part of that work is through bringing many, many voices together. We have a steering committee with 38 members. We have 5 work groups that collectively have nearly 100 members. We had nearly 1,000 people from across the state apply to join these work groups. I have members of the committee and the work groups on my esteemed panel here with me, and in our wonderful moderator. I want to particularly acknowledge the co-chairs of our 5 work groups, and several of them are here. Will Liner, I see you. Fernando Gomez, I see you. Oscar Mercado, who was on our previous panel. Yes, let's give them a round of applause. Oscar Mercado, who was on our previous panel, Keish Weller, who I think I saw here just a minute ago, and so many others, right? And one of the things that we've done is we've made sure that the 5 co-chairs, or the 5 work groups, are co-chaired, and each one of them is co-chaired by a person with a developmental disability, because and Keish walks in just as I was saying, thank you, Keish, for being a leader in this space. So we wanted to make sure that we are centering the work that we are doing in the voices of people with lived experience who are self-advocates, who have developmental disabilities, because this system is about them. And what I learned from the very first day that I started engaging with the independent living disability rights movement is that mantra, nothing about us without us, right? So we know that we don't know everything. And I am so grateful to all of those diverse committee members, all of those diverse work group members for giving the state folks who are trying to figure out how to move this forward, for telling us how you want this to move forward, because we know that we don't know everything. But if we multiplied that number of people tenfold, if we had, instead of nearly 100 people across the 5 work groups, if we had nearly 1,000 people or 10,000 people, it still wouldn't be enough, right? Because there are so many perspectives, there are so many diverse voices. And so one of the things that we've really been focusing on is going out into community and getting as much feedback as possible. We're having a lot of conversations here about data, and there's a lot of really important data that we can quantify, that we can attach a number to, right? But there's also a lot of data that is not easy to attach a number to. That's qualitative data. You heard that in the first panel. That is people's stories, that is people's lived experience, right? And in going across communities and hearing from different voices, that qualitative data, even though you can't always attach a number to it, is as real and as important as all of the really important numerical data that we are striving to make sure we have access to. And I'll say just in this past week alone, we've had the wonderful opportunity to present to a group of Korean family support networks. We've had an opportunity to connect with disability leaders in the independent living movement. We had an opportunity to connect with people with developmental disabilities who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we had a wonderful, last Friday in Modesto, a wonderful 5-hour session that was just for self-advocates, just for people with developmental disabilities. So it was just their voices that were being heard, unfiltered. So that is incredibly powerful, important, compelling data. It's also hard. It's also hard because there's so much and it can start to feel overwhelming. And what do we do with that, right? So one of the things that we're doing is we have a team of consultants who are helping us collect all of that data. And we are trying to figure out the right ways to start tagging it and theming it and figuring out, are there things that are showing up across the board that are aligning with the recommendations that the different work groups for the master plan are beginning to develop, so that we can say to them, yes, you're on the right track, +1, +2, +3, that one. Are there things that are prominently showing up in that qualitative data that none of the work groups have surfaced, because maybe we missed something. Maybe in our effort to bring in diverse voices, there's a type of voice that we missed. Or maybe there was a self-selecting problem, right? Maybe the kinds of individuals who have the bandwidth and capacity to join these efforts and do this kind of work, they might be missing a perspective like justice involved, right? Like the impact that law enforcement has, okay? And also, how do we make sure that if there is a perspective that's missing, we are bringing it to the table? And sometimes the numerical data alone, as important as it is, won't capture that. And so I want to thank all of you for being here, because that kind of qualitative data requires vulnerability. We saw some incredible vulnerability this morning already, and I think we will see more. And I want to thank all of you for being a partner in this effort, and I'm so excited for what's to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victor. Our final speaker is Alison Morantz, a Stanford law professor and the director of the Stanford IDD Law and Policy Project.
Thanks. How am I doing on time? I know we're a little bit, okay. Sigh, okay. So briefly, who am I? I'm a parent. I'm the parent of an 18-year-old who has, in addition to autism, co-occurring mental illness. And so I run a program for him, a very complicated program. He's served by San Andreas Regional Center. I am a law professor, but maybe most importantly for this panel, I'm a researcher. And I think the word research, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And I sometimes hear a lot of skepticism about, like, what's the point of research? We know what the problems are. Like, how's that going to help me today? How's that going to help me tomorrow? Right. And it can seem a little bit abstract, a little bit sort of far afield. We collect all this data. That's nice. That's great. But how's that data going to actually be deployed in a way that will improve people's lived experience? So as a researcher, I want to try to make the case for research because that's my main focus in the context of the master plan that Victor just described, the one that's particularly focused on data. And I guess I want to try to persuade you that if you want to take that data and use it as kind of the fuel to make people's lives better, then research is the thing that happens in between. Because just data by itself, no matter how many powerful and moving stories you have, no matter how many statistics you have, I mean, they can tell a story that moves people in the moment, but they don't drive policy. They don't get laws changed. They don't get regulations changed. So let me try to make that more concrete and see if I can persuade those, if they're skeptics, and I'm sure there's some of you in the audience. Okay, so why does research matter? And when I talk about research, I'm largely talking about the kind of research that isn't done in a system, which is social science research. It pretty much isn't being done right now. And that's because we're just not collecting the data in a way that social scientists can use. So, you know, there's no light being shined on our system at all. So it's pretty much ignored by social scientists in the state and elsewhere, with really rare exception when they can get their hands on detailed data. But let me try to persuade you for why it matters. Well, one thing, 4 reasons. One is that data can, and research using good data can help us understand what the biggest problems really are. We've talked about that already, right? And the problem is sometimes there's more than one cause of a problem, and we don't know which ones are the biggest. Like, for example, if we have big disparities in receipt of services across different regions, let's say, Amy, this was picking up on a couple of prior speakers. Well, there's different hypotheses for why that's the case. It could be that some people just don't know about certain kinds of services, let's just say supported living services. Some people may just not know that that's even something they can ask for. They may not even know it's available in their area, so they may not ask. That's one possibility. It could be that people are asking for it, and some regional centers are saying no, they're not approving the services. Why? I don't know, they're trying to save money or bias. There's any number of reasons. It could be that regional centers are approving it, but there just aren't providers to provide the service. Maybe there's a shortage of providers in that area. So even if it's an approved, it's not actually getting authorized because there's a shortage of vendors and providers. Those are 3 different possible explanations Could be some combination of them, but without detailed data, we don't know which one's right. And they have very different solutions. And that's the kind of thing that we need to know before we develop targeted solutions that can actually make problems better. We need to know what is the root cause of the problem. Right now, the data is not being collected in a way that social scientists can find out. It's an answerable question. It is actually being looked at in a similar way in other systems. For example, most prominently, child welfare. Child welfare has spent years putting together really integrated data from many different systems, including, by the way, the regional center system, to understand kind of that pipeline across the lifespan, not just of employment and objective outcomes, but also in some contexts, subjective well-being. Are people thriving? Are kids thriving? That data is not being put together right now in a way that we can do that research. So anyway, the first reason is understand the root causes of problems. That's the first thing. And I tried to give a concrete example of that. The second reason is to come up with good solutions to those problems, right? If the real reason, if the biggest kind of thing that is failing in that pipeline is that in certain areas there's a shortage of providers, maybe actually regional centers are approving supported living, whatever it is we're focused on in similar rates, but they're not getting authorized. There's something DDS can do about that. We can do requests for proposals. We could adjust rates if there's, have extra resources available in underserved areas, right? But if it's that certain regional centers are not approving supported living at the same rate, that's a different problem and requires a different solution. So in addition to understanding and diagnosing problems better, data and research, most importantly, the right kind of research helps us develop good solutions. The third thing it does is it helps us persuade people in power that we actually should spend money on this, right? Because we can tell stories all day long, and sometimes stories are helpful, right, in different legislative contexts, but stories alone do not persuade legislative staff if that's all you have. You have to have the data to back up those stories, right? And that's a point Vivian made at the beginning. How do you know it's not just a one-off? Like maybe you even have 10 people testifying, but is this a statewide thing? Is it a regional thing? Legislative staff and different branches of government, they like to see the research backing up the stories. The two combined are incredibly powerful, and we've seen that in the context of DVU. When we've lined up the individual stories and the research to back it up, we have gotten laws passed. That happened several years ago in the context of fair hearing reform. So another reason research is important is because it's what drives policy. It persuades the people that are in a position to get laws passed in different branches of government. The fourth reason, the last one, although probably not an exhaustive list, is that it helps us figure out if the solutions that we design are actually working. Because these are hard problems. We know this. They're multifaceted. And sometimes we may come up with solutions that sound really good. They look good on paper, but it turns out there's something we didn't think about. Unintended consequences, something's more complicated than we thought. With the right data, we specify a particular outcome that we want to see. For example, maybe reducing inequality in actual authorization and receipt of supported living. Again, I have so many examples. I'm pulling that out of a hat. And if our policy solution is not working, we need to come up with a better one. We need to go back to the drawing board, look at the data in a different way, and take another crack at it. That sometimes happens. But at least we have a feedback loop, and that is what meaningful accountability looks like. And unless and until we start shining a light on, in this context, on our system, gathering the data and making that data available to social scientists so they can deploy the data to conduct the right research, to diagnose the problems, come up with solutions that at least seem promising, that are targeted to the root of those problems, and then in a sense, market those problems to policymakers so they actually get passed into law or regulation, and then see if they work. And then if not, start that loop again. We're not going to meaningfully change the disparities, which is of course our focus. So to me, that's what it really means to say we know what we don't know. It's to take it a step further and put a system and process in place to evaluate what we don't know, understand it better, and try to solve it. That's really what it's about. And that's how we ultimately take the abstract idea of research and sort of implement it in a way that makes individuals, people's lives better and starts changing the narratives and the stories we've heard today. So we start hearing more positive stories and at least sort of tilt that towards a more effective system. Wow, I have 1 minute left. Okay. Didn't expect that. I guess just another couple words about Child's Data Network with my last few minutes. There really is an opportunity right now. I was shocked to learn how far data on the child welfare system has come within state government. They've actually matched many different data sources that relate to Kids and Child Network, including educational data, including all health and human services. And that is such a powerful tool. And those things are matched at the individual level. You can track them over time and available to researchers. That's incredibly powerful. And there's no reason we can't do the exact same thing. It's just a matter of political will and granted some funding and buy-in from different agencies. But I think this is the moment that we can do it. And I really hope, and I am sitting next to somebody in a position who I know is my ally on this issue, I believe, I hope, and other people in this room, to make it happen through the master plan process, because it's a real opportunity to put this on really the front burner of the state for the first time in decades. It hasn't happened ever. And okay, I'll stop early.
Yay. Start talking.
Victor, sit where I can see you, because my courage is running out, so I've asked for reasonable accommodation. I'm just gonna talk to you, pretend I'm just having a conversation with you. I have permission to ask this panel a question, and I thought really hard about what question to ask. I hope this question is okay, because I haven't run it past her. I'm on the master plan with you. The master plan is such a big, important thing. It feels so overwhelming. If we can't get it right, how can we fix it? So I have a question. If we have all this data that shows that people of color and the Latino community aren't being properly served, why hasn't anyone made them redo the IPPs and IEPs for those people? And can we put it in the master plan for them to do that? Because my brain thinks that's the only way to fix it. I mean, it might be naive, but to me, if they're not being served properly, we need to redo their IPPs and get it done right. Help me fix it.
So first, I want to say that I am with you. I'm so overwhelmed. It's overwhelming. We're putting so much into this. But I also want to say that the master plan is not going to be a one and done thing, right? We're going to make mistakes. Let me say that up front, because it's being made by people and people are imperfect. But we are also going to stay committed to learning from our mistakes and doing better. I don't have the answer to your question. I don't think there is one answer to the question. I think that's why it takes the collective wisdom of all of the work groups and all of the communities that we're hearing from. I don't know what recommendations will ultimately end up in the master plan. I think there's some really interesting ideas happening. I think the reason that we have leaders like you in the work group is so that you can raise what you see as a solution, so that we can put sunshine on it and bring it before everyone and say, is this part of the constellation of solutions that we are going to advocate for to make things right, to make things better?
It's going blind because we're not serving them right. We have to do better.
And Tina just said people should not be dying and going blind. we have to do better. And that's absolutely right. I also want to acknowledge a really, really hard truth. I think we owe it to each other to be honest. We have to do lots of things at the same time. We have to address the needs that people have today with the people who have them today. And the truth is that the master plan process is not going to help the people who have the needs today. One of the things that many of you who've heard me speak in other settings have heard me say that the problem with the master plan is that it is moving way too fast and way too slow. It is moving way too slow for the people who needed this help yesterday. It is moving way too slow for the people who needed help today. It's also moving way too fast if our intention is to genuinely and thoughtfully hear the voices of all of the different communities that we need to hear from. I want to pick up on something that Alison said that ties to that really hard and complicated truth that we're wrestling with. There might be, and there probably should be, recommendations in the master plan about what data we don't have today that we need to get, or what data we need to have access to that we can't access today. We should probably do that on several fronts. And to a mom who is struggling right now and needs help right now, that as a recommendation feels like it falls so far short. To say, we're going to collect data that we don't have today so that tomorrow we can come up with a solution, so that tomorrow after that we can pilot, so that tomorrow after that we can implement. And people are saying, but my life is not happening tomorrow after tomorrow after tomorrow. My life is happening today, right? And so we need to be aware and honest about doing many things at once together, knowing what the master plan is and what it isn't, and that independently of the master plan, we collectively as people who care about this community have a responsibility to hold accountable the systems that are supposed to be serving and safeguarding people today, right? Because, and Dr. Galley and others in the administration have said, this plan is not intended to say, okay, everyone gets to just relax and hang back, and then at some point in the future, when the master plan is done, you will have your marching orders on what tomorrow looks like. We have to do two things at the same time. We have to do many things at the same time. We have to create a master plan that sets us up for the future we want, but that doesn't mean that we are not responsible for fighting every day to deal with what we need to deal with today, right? And, you know, recently somebody said to me, do you know when the best time to plant a tree is? The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. Right? We have family and children who needed the shade and protection of that tree 20 years ago, who needed it today. But we will also have those same families and children who need the shade and protection of that tree in 20 years. So we're going to plant the tree today, knowing we won't all get to benefit from it today, and work with the reality we have today to help those folks who need that help today. And that is an insufficient answer to your question. And it's the best one I have at this moment. But that's why I was not asked to do this for what I can do. I was asked to do this for what we can do.
for each of us.
I want to give all of you a chance to comment on something you heard from another panelist. First. Sorry.
Thank you, Tina. And you are doing a lovely job. You have nothing to be sorry for. Thank you. There's just so much that we could say. Building off of what Victor was just talking about, it's so critical that, as you say, we do both. We walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to. We have to. We have no other choice. So if we think about the master plan and also just everything we do in the policy space and then at the smallest space, you know, the regional center level, the IPP level, I think it's important to start thinking about when Tina or others ask, well, what can we do? Why aren't we doing X? Why don't we just do Y? We have to start thinking about what are some big solutions that are going to be a very heavy lift, and what are some things that are smaller that can be done and put into place more quickly. And maybe they aren't the be all end all. They're not going to have a humongous impact, but they are at least something that we can start with. And that can start to make a tangible difference, a small one on the ground, sooner rather than later, so that we are doing both at the same time. And that's very challenging, but I think it is necessary. And I hope that this afternoon is a great space to start to do that. One suggestion that I would have for those sessions and just afterward is, remember how I talked about the heavy lift? We are all in this together. I know that's a cliche. We've also talked about what other systems are already doing, what they have done and are doing. There are many, many adjacent spaces right next door to the DD system, other systems that are better developed, further along with regard to data, research, programs, working across agencies and breaking down silos. It's not perfect. They still have problems. But to the degree that those things are already in motion, how can we hook on to those trains that are already taking off and already moving? Because it's so hard for us to start those things from scratch, right? That's very resource intensive. But there are other things right next door that are already moving. Is there an IDD element? How are we as people with disabilities, as a system, how is DDS, how are regional centers showing up in that system to say, hey, I need to be part of this effort, whether it's for children and behavioral health, whether it's for CalAIM, all these other major initiatives. If you look closely right now, DDS, regional centers, and people with IDD are not very visible. They're not very seen, they're not very heard in those other spaces. Why? There are probably a lot of reasons, but in other words, we can create our own and try to work on our own solutions. We have to, but that's also, we only have so much time to spare, right? We only have so much funding and energy and effort. Let's try to, where can we team up, right? And where can we draft off the momentum of other initiatives, good ones that are moving forward elsewhere in the state and federally?
Yeah, I guess I was trying to knit together, Victor, your comment, and Tina, your point. I mean, I agree with you. There's no, it's this kind of paradox. That's right. I like the metaphor of the tree, but it's not a full answer. But I do think once you actually create, Tina, I don't know if this kind of goes much further, but when you create a robust sort of research pipeline, if it's done well, it's community engaged. It engages with the community that it's meant to understand. And even if the fruits of that particular research don't actually, actually materialize for years down the road, when you get the community engaged, there's a sense in which the community itself is paying more attention. I think the media pays more attention. I think you're gathering more stories along the way. that in a different mechanism, not through the research, but just through sort of more organically in a more grassroots way, tends to build more accountability too. It's not a perfect solution, but I guess I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic that at least some of the time, indirectly through just sort of knitting communities closer together through the research process and through gathering that research, you can maybe to some extent address sort of some of those immediate extreme needs. But it's not a fully, anyway, I was just trying to connect those 2 points.
All right. I wanted to reflect back on something Alison was talking about, or a couple of things that she was talking about in making her pitch for research, which is a hard pitch. I get that. But you know, I think that I really appreciate you surfacing that we need to not only understand what we're dissatisfied with or what is not working, but we need to understand the why, because that will help us to do better. But also, one of the things that you mentioned was the importance of the feedback loop. So we are going to have to try things. We're going to have to see if they make things better, and some of them won't. And we need to then say, okay, we tried that. Let's try something else that's based on a theory, based on why we think something is happening. So all of that is just highlighting that there are a lot of really well-meaning people working in this space, desperately trying to find solutions, trying to make things better. And sometimes, despite the best of intents and the best theories about what's going on, things won't necessarily get better from that one thing, but it's then not a failure. We've learned something from it, and we need to try something else and keep trying, because at the end of the day, our entire goal needs to be improving the lives of people with disabilities and their families, and doing so through that lens of equity and making things better. And that is a process that is imperfect. And just appreciate everyone's grace with the process and understand that it's a bumpy road and that it won't be solved tomorrow or even today.
This is such a rich conversation. I wish this could go on, right, for a much longer time, but I'll say a few things. I really appreciate, Amy, what you were saying about giving grace to ourselves and to each other with what is a very long and difficult and imperfect process for trying to get better, to look at what's not working and then figure out how to correct it, because that is not easy. And conversations about that process are not easy, because sometimes it involves criticism or points that sound and feel, and honestly, sometimes are critical, very critical. Sometimes that can feel like finger pointing or blame or shame, which is rife and happens when you're dealing with people who have been failed over and over again, who have run into barrier after barrier, who have tried to speak up and felt like they have not been heard. There's emotions, and they can get dicey. So one of the things that you talked about earlier was about how wrenching it is to hear stories where multiple systems failed people at the same time, or one right after the other. Some people might call that structural racism. But when I say structural racism, just by itself, that can put some people who are in those systems that have combined for multiple failures to feel on the defensive immediately. Because they're like, I'm not racist, right? There's like, I have no intent. I'm working hard. I'm doing the best I can with what I have, which I know is not enough, but it feels judgy, and it can change the valence, the temperature of that conversation. But if we say it in the way that you said it, which is multiple systems failed this person or this community again and again, you know what? It's been happening for a long time. that's what researchers often call structural racism. And so I just bring this up because when we talk about racism and equity, I think it requires, just an openness and a softness to have grace for each other, knowing that the problems that we inherit, even if the problems are not our fault, they're our shared responsibility, and to not let those feelings get in the way of having productive conversations about all the things that we were just talking about.
Thank you all for coming and being on the panel.